One of the games I've been really looking forward to recently is The Callisto Protocol, a survival horror game from the team behind the original Dead Space, one of my favorite games of all time. The promotion material showed a game drenched in atmosphere and dread. It really looked like it could be a true spiritual successor to Dead Space. And seeing Glenn Schofield's name attached to the game had me very hyped about this release, especially considering the direction Dead Space took with the third game and its subsequent cancellation by EA. It really looked like Resident Evil wasn't going to be carrying the survival horror torch on their own for long. When the game released on December 2nd, 2022, it seemed like it would kick off a year of massive games for survival horror fans, and being the only game of the big four that wasn't a remake, those being Silent Hill 2, Dead Space, Resident Evil 4 and the Callisto Protocol, along with the hype material they released for it, fans of the genre had plenty to be excited for. But even though some references might fool you otherwise, this game leans more on the Glenn Schofield who directed Call of Duty than the one who crafted Dead Space, resulting in a game with very light survival horror aspects and a lot of focus on bombastic cutscenes and linear level design. I won't go into great detail on the story, I will mostly be focusing on the design of the game, but I will be showing content from the entire game, so be warned. The game starts with a cutscene of a woman named Dani on one of Jupiter's moons, Europa. Something is clearly wrong as she's seen wearing a gas mask and gets attacked by a dying man out on the streets. Apparently she is part of the terrorist organization The Outer Way and are responsible for whatever it is that is happening here. We then cut to our main protagonist, Jacob, played by Josh Duhamel, who for some reason I keep mixing up with Timothy Olyphant, but apparently Timothy's mom does too, so you can't really blame me. Jacob and his friend Max gets boarded by The Outer Way while transporting some apparently valuable cargo to Callisto and ends up in an altercation with them. In the aftermath, Max is killed and Jacob is forcibly taken into the prison by Captain Leon Ferris, played by a severely underutilized Sam Witwer, that really steals the show in the few scenes he's in. We are also introduced to Duncan Cole, the warden that runs the prison and who seems to be the big bad of the game. Jacob is then taken to Dr. Caitlin Mahler, who forcibly implants a core device into his neck while he tries to convince her that he's not supposed to be there, but she could not care less. Later on, Jacob wakes up in his cell while everything is falling apart, since the virus unleashed on Europa has made its way into Callisto as well, and it is now up to Jacob to get out of the prison and survive the outbreak. After getting out of his cell, Jacob finds himself battling through mostly mutated humans called the Biophage, using a melee heavy combat system designed to get you up close and personal with all the horrors the game has to offer. The combat system is surprised with dodging to the left or right, while blocking is done by pressing backwards. The melee attacks can be followed up by counterattacks with your weapon in order to dismember specific parts of their body. And this is the first thing that sets the Callisto Protocol apart from other survival horror experiences. Instead of conserving ammo and staying away from enemies, you're actually encouraged to get up close and personal with them. Attacks feel like there's a real weight to them, and the whole thing is actually quite a satisfying and brutally gory visual spectacle with excellent sound design. The game also features death animations that, while few, are extremely brutal and are on par with anything that Mortal Kombat can throw your way. It really feels like the enemies just hate your very being and they live to hurt you. Stealth is also introduced pretty early on and consists of crouching down and sneaking up on enemies to perform a backstabbing move which instantly kills them. Although, as you'll see later, this mechanic has a pretty glaring fault that we will get to. The game also introduces the gravity restraint projector, the grip, which allows you to pick up enemies and shoot them into traps or machinery around the level. It is sort of like the Jedi powers in Star Wars, however, as with a lot of things in this game, it is a severely underutilized mechanic because you never really use it for anything significant. It's basically just a way of picking things up and throwing them around. In most of the combat encounters you use it to throw enemies into spikes on the wall or spinning traps and make them explode. While it's gory and cool, there's just so many things the designers could have used it for aside from combat. For example, in Dead Space you use the kinesis model to solve puzzles, while here it just mostly boils down to being a cheap way to insta-kill enemies. There are also 5 guns that you can find in the game, although without upgrades there isn't really that much of a difference between them and you're essentially left with a pistol, a shotgun and an assault rifle. The final upgrades do add things like explosive rounds or throwing things at a high velocity with the grip, but the regular upgrades themselves are pretty basic and for the most part just translate into increased damage, increased ammo capacity and increased stability. Now, the way the guns fit into the melee heavy combat system is that when performing successful combos, you can perform a quick shot, which is basically a way of combining your other weapons into the string of attacks and doing more damage. This allows you to conserve ammo, which should be a staple game mechanic in any survival horror game, but since the game emphasizes dodging and counterattacks, it's never really necessary to be all that conservative with the ammo to begin with. Most enemies you're just gonna beat into the ground while saving your ammo for the quick shot, so you're only gonna waste like 1 to 2 bullets per enemy if you dodge correctly, and don't get me wrong, in this game dodging is extremely easy. Like all you need to do is wait for the enemies to attack, then press left or right, but never in the same direction twice. And somehow I even managed to kill one of the game's harder boss types enemies by just dodging every single one of his attacks. I didn't even realize you can melee him when he was down. I just kept dodging him until I killed him, and I was like, well, this is a bullet sponge if I've ever seen one. That is essentially how easy the system is. I even reloaded the fight just to see if I could do it again, and in the process I managed to trigger a bit of a bug, which I'll talk more about later because it was super funny. Dismembering enemies also doesn't really change them in any significant way. In Dead Space you had reason to dismember enemies since it altered the way they could attack you, and it also made the game feel more diverse. In Callisto Protocol you could remove the system almost entirely and nothing much would change in terms of combat. The game can also be pretty like hit or miss with this lock-on system, because it's supposed to make you focus on the enemy you're currently attacking. So for example, at one point early on in the game I missed an execute prompt and I got jumped by 4 enemies and didn't even use the environment or any of the explosive containers lying around, and I still managed to survive. But when I was attacking this dude, all the enemies behind me would just stand and wait their turn for some reason. However, at other times, since the camera focuses on whoever you are attacking, it sort of makes you lose situational awareness, so you know that there are enemies around you, but you never know when they're gonna attack. So in fights with multiple opponents, it's pretty common for enemies to jump at you from behind unless you keep backing away after a hit or two, which with the focus camera is kind of annoying. Also, another fun thing is that in some fights, if you're lucky, you can even catch 2 enemies and whack them both to pieces simultaneously. However, this overpowered feeling actually works against the horror elements of the game, because the game is almost too good at making you feel like you're really beating the crap out of everything in sight, because you can push enemies into traps or up against the wall to perform new finishing moves where you just basically totally obliterate them. It is almost a bit jarring in a way. Like imagine a horror movie set in a prison where mutated aliens have taken over and the prisoners just respond by running into those things and just beating the crap out of them over and over. I know there is power creeping in video games, but overpowered melee just doesn't seem to belong in a horror game, because even in a game like Condemned, your items could break and you didn't feel like an unstoppable badass. And in that game you were just fighting regular humans. Like in here you're fighting these like monstrosities that you're just like jumping into fist fights with for some reason. I mean, it really does feel like the combat just belongs in a like full-blown action game, and is sort of not surprising given Glenn Schofield's work on Call of Duty. I honestly feel like this game would have had a better reception had it been marked as a shooter with horror elements akin to something like Fear instead of a spiritual successor to Dead Space. Because it is really satisfying just shooting your way through the hordes of enemies, because the gunplay is really good. And like combine it with the grip and it sort of feels like you're like a low-level psyker in Warhammer is blasting your way through some nerd-light enemies. Later on in the game, tentacles start bursting out of enemies, which you have to shoot before the enemies mutate further. But even if you do let them transform, they don't really get any special powers or get longer reach or anything special like the Las Plagas from Resident Evil 4. It just makes them stronger overall, which is quite a shame because the game doesn't really have that much variation in its enemy design. And I think that is because you actually have to be able to box with them. And I can imagine that it's really hard and complicated to create like true monsters with variety when they all need to have telegraphed melee attacks that can always be dodgeable. Like, you basically have to be able to box with these things, which is why I think they are mostly humanoids. For example, something like the Las Plagas that have like long range attacks doesn't really make sense with this system, and it really sort of limits the enemy variety since you're basically just fighting humanoids. Blind humanoids, humanoid robots, large humanoids, two-headed humanoids, crawling, exploiting humanoids, and this one head that pops up every now and then that tries to drag you off into danger. And one of the few non-humanoid enemies are actually in one of my favorite, although very, very small area, which is the Botanical Garden, where enemies start jumping around in trees, and I actually got pretty spooked when I shone a light in the trees, revealing an enemy before I got jumped by them. And the way the audio is set up here makes it feel like they're coming at you from every angle, just jumping out in trees, and it's a really good place and it's one of my favorites in the game, even though it is very, very tiny. Towards the end of the game, what would have been like my favorite section of the game is actually introduced, and it is entirely stealth-based. A new blind enemy is introduced that bases its movement on sound, and if alerted will scream and basically alert all the other enemies nearby and swarm you. Crouching and avoiding detection makes for some pretty intense moments, until you realize that the entire stealth section is 100% broken by the fact that enemies who base their sound on hearing literally can't hear you. Like stabbing their friends to death right next to them doesn't alert them them or anything, and I don't know how this passed QA testing, as it seems like such an obvious bug. Like, all they need to do is add whatever audio event they have for all the other sounds in the game just to the backstab maneuver. Like, the only thing that I can think of this why they didn't do that is because it would make the stealth too hard or something, but either way it just ruins the entire area of the game, so you can just backstab your way through the entirety of it. Now, the game does come with a new game mode plus, but I'm not sure why you will want to try it out unless you really love unskippable cutscenes. You essentially end the game with all the weapons unlocked, but still fighting the same old enemies from the beginning. So like restarting the game and doing it all over again has no real purpose unless you want to complete it to 100% or something. So the best part of the game, and what seemed to be its main selling point in its trailers, is its world and immersive atmosphere combined with excellent sound design. And this is something that the game totally nails. Like, there's almost nothing wrong with the atmosphere in this game. So one of the cool parts about this game's audio is that it's using what's called the apprehension engine, also known as a nightmare machine. And it's one of the coolest audio things that I have ever heard in a video game. Like, it is essentially a Frankenstein's monster of musical instruments that was designed specifically with the purpose of scoring horror movies. And you can like hear it all over the place in the game, producing like otherworldly sounds that are really unsettling. Overall, the sound design is really excellent. You know, spinning machines feel threatening and mechanical, and you can really hear the cogs and wheels turning inside of everything. The sound in the depressurizing chamber is deafening, and I even got jump scared the first time I heard it, so. And there's also one particular moment in the game where enemies are basically jumping around in the trees, and it gives a really great like paranoid feeling, since it sounds like they could be just about anywhere. And it's one of my favorite parts of the game, because you're just walking around and it's almost like the predator is out there lurking in the trees. It's like ready to pounce at you. I wish they would have just expanded this area because it's so good. And guns sound great, and the melee attacks break the bones, and there really isn't like much to complain about in the sound department, honestly. One thing that doesn't stand out as much to me is the gore system. And in an interview with IGN, Glenn talked about how they had spent like a year at Striking Distance Studios working on the gore system and explaining how players may not see the same torn apart guy twice. In reality, however, most of the enemies either just stick to the wall or literally just explode upon impact with anything that spins around in basically exactly the same way every time. Like, it's a cool feature and it fits a horror game, but there's just not enough like variety or use cases for it, and they could have just made the system way better. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room for a second, which is the game's level design. Unfortunately, the level design is not what you'd expect from a big survival horror title, and certainly not one that's from the creator of Dead Space itself. There's no backtracking, there's no interconnected level design like on the Ishimura or the police station in RE2. And the thing about that is that a lot of the tension that is built up from knowing that you have to go back to an area you previously ran from because it's either filled with enemies or something new is lurking down below is just completely removed from this game, because all you're doing is just keep walking forward and it sort of just never ends. The areas in those games also progressively change and new enemies are introduced to keep you on edge. Instead, you're constantly pressing forward while crawling through vent after vent after vent and going through tight space after tight space, and it is nothing but tedious. And it is only done in order to cover up that assets are being loaded into game. But if it's going to be this egregious, like, just give me a loading screen and be done with it. Like, don't put players through this thing over and over. And this thing is also made worse by the fact that even though the camera zooms in on the player in sort of like a tense sort of way, nothing ever really happens, except that one time you get a moment that was already all over the promotion material. And of course, once you exit one of the vents or crawl spaces, you basically just press forward like you're playing some sort of on-rails experience, like Layers of Fear. And if I wanted to play a bad horror game, I just played that instead. So yeah, the game has simple combat, Call of Duty-like cutscenes, extreme linearity, and only having like light elements of the genre the game claims to be in. Yeah, sounds like Uncharted to me. And the sad part about all of this is that there's actually a part in the game where you're walking down yet another corridor, but this time there's a moving trap that looks like it's like straight out of The Evil Within. It is going up and down the hallway while enemies are coming after you, and it really breaks up the monotony of the game. And I wish they'd just use more things like this to spice things up, because there aren't any puzzles in this game, and there's nothing that really breaks up the variety or anything. It's just like corridor after corridor, and they should have just put in more trap spaces like this. And also, what is up with these secret rooms? Like literally all you need to do is find one, is to look down a room you're about to enter, ask yourself, does this look like a new area or like a cutscene would play there? If yes, just walk the other way through the other door that's behind you instead, and you'll find a secret area. Like, come on guys, like I don't even know why you put this in at this point. And speaking of the secret rooms, there's actually some of them that they could have just expanded into like real areas. Like look at this like alien Lovecraftian sort of nightmarish red room, or this place with like a fog that covers the ground. Like when I first got in here, I was actually pretty excited because I thought that this was going to be like an area where enemies are popping out of the thick fog on the ground and you can't see them and you're going to be paranoid and like shooting things up. But in the end, it's just one small room. And like, if they had made this an entire area, they could have made it like one of the coolest places in the game, because it reminds me of that, you know, the ceiling alien with all the eggs are lying around and like anything can just come at you from out of anywhere. And speaking of which, since you're basically just running down corridors the entire game, you never get the sense that enemies could just come and attack you from anywhere. Even though there are vents, they aren't really used in the same way that they are in Dead Space, where enemies can just pop out from behind you. And since the game is so melee heavy, you're not exactly afraid of getting down to business with the enemies either. So there's just something like lacking here. Like you never really have to use the environment to like retreat and seek cover. You just sort of dive in head first and start hammering away at everything that you see. Now let's get into some of the, like the bugs and quirks of the game, and believe me, there's a ton of them. So the first one is there's so many sections where you're only allowed to walk, and it's basically because they want to control when things happen and audio cues, triggers and so on, but it's just like, stop this, we don't need this, and if you need this area, take it out and make it shorter. Like nobody wants to do this. And there's also like some funny things about the melee that I noticed. While you're hitting enemies, the system is pretty fine, but then when you like hit stuff in the environment, like when you're trying to break the glass open, it's just something just feels weak. It's like they're missing effects and audio cues that just make the whole punch seem like useless. The stomp, you know, it's the famous stomp that they had in Dead Space, but in this game it's not the same, and it sounds like a weak imitation. When I recorded the video for this game, I actually started playing New Game Plus and I had to recompile my shaders, and afterwards like the textures would just never load. Like I played for I think an hour and they never came back. So well, stuff happens, I guess. And one of the really like annoying things about this game is that a lot of the background is delivered through audio logs that you are not allowed to exit out from the menu when you're listening to them. And there's just no way that I'm gonna listen to all these audio files, and I would have preferred it if the game just had the holograms showing key moments. And I know I realize that like this is harder to make, but there could just be fewer of them, or like just let me start up a radio like in BioShock or Dead Space and just listen to the audio while I'm walking around, but don't make me sit through this thing and not being able to move while doing it. Like nobody wants to do this anymore. It's 2023, guys. And another thing that's also really annoying is that you have to manually save, since the auto saves are so infrequent. But even that alone can have its issues, as I learned the hard way when I saved the game after picking up some health items and before a big boss battle took place. And then once I respawned because I died, I respawned all the way back at the checkpoint, and then when I loaded the save I had created, I still ended up back at the checkpoint without any of the progress that I had saved. Like I still had the same health and no items picked up, and I like even double checked that I actually loaded the same save file. So something weird is going on there. And also, who on earth designed this like weapon swap input? On PC you have to press 2, then scroll up or down to select a weapon, and then press again with the left mouse button to choose the weapon. And it has to be like the most awkward way to switch weapons I've seen in a long time. And I know there's a quick swap button, but there's like zero reason for me to not be able to switch this weapon on the fly, considering how long it takes to equip them. And also another funny bug that I managed to trigger was somehow I missed triggering a hologram, and I was sort of like stuck in this room, and then I found a vent and I was like, okay, I'm supposed to go here, but I couldn't crawl into it like it would normally do where the animation triggers, so I ended sort of getting stuck inside of the vent. And then a box spawned behind me and I was basically stuck, and me being a game developer, I was like, well, I'm gonna try and get out. You know, I couldn't. So I reload the entire area, and lo and behold, the animations and the hologram gets triggered and the box is set up where it's supposed to be, and all you had to do was like move it to get past it. But like, maybe it's like a 1 in a million bug, but this is like something that the QA should have picked up on. Like, I don't know, guys. I think people who are expecting this to be the next Dead Space will find the game to be quite disappointing, as it just doesn't hit the mark. The survival horror aspects just aren't there. It feels more like a beat-em-up action shooter that is almost as on rails as a Bloober game is. It has tons of unskippable cutscenes, and it kind of relies on them to carry the game forward. You're basically playing to see the next cutscene, and it feels more at home in like a generic AAA action game than in a survival horror title. I mean, I don't think anyone wanted this game not to be good, but unfortunately with its rocky launch, the game sold well below Krafton's expectations. I have to say, their expectations were quite lofty to begin with. I mean, they had a sales goal of 5 million when Dead Space 2, which was like the most popular and liked game of the franchise, sold 4 million total. They basically copied EA's mistake of just like projecting absurd numbers, and as a result, I highly doubt we'll get a sequel that fixes the problem with the first game. And what is such a shame about it is that this year is basically only going to be remakes. We're gonna get the Silent Hill 2 remake, the Dead Space remake, Last of Us Part 1 on PC, and the Resident Evil 4 remake. And in the end, it's just us gamers who are losers. Like, I remember back when EA announced Dead Space, Mirror's Edge, and Army of Two, and before that, EA was basically like this big evil publisher that didn't care for gamers, and all of a sudden they just created some of the like new and interesting and most beloved franchises that built really strong fan bases, only for them to mess all of them up with like greedy expectations of what a game needs to sell in order to be successful. Like, I don't know, maybe if someone didn't press the wrong button when the Callisto Protocol launched, maybe it would have sold better, and not casting as much doubt on the future of the franchise, because as it stands right now, gamers really need some new fresh blood in the survival horror space.